take great pride in introducing the charming 18th century romantic ballad, A Frog He Would, A Wooing Go. Go.
A frog he would woo and go, hey ho, said Rolly, whether his mother would let him or no, with a roly-poly gammon and spinach, hey ho, said Anthony Rolly.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Next verse. He came to sweet Miss Mousie's hall, hey ho, said Rolly, he gave a loud knock and he gave a loud call with a roly-poly.
Charming.
Thank you. Next verse. But while they there were merry-making, hey ho, said Rolly, a cat and her kittens came tumbling in with a roly-poly
coming Anthony Rolly. Oh, yes. Sheer poetry, isn't it?
Well, I think I'd like it more if I understood the words.
Oh, well, which words?
Well, let's start with, a frog he would a wooing go.
Aha! Oh, yes, that. This shows us that there was a time when frogs indeed used to go woo.
Frogs don't go woo-woo, they go ribbit.
Only very recently.
Hey ho, said Anthony Rolly.
Oh, yes, that one. The precise meaning of the expression hey ho is lost in antiquity. You won't find any modern rubbish here.
With a roly-poly gammon and spinach?
Oh, yes.
What's that?
That's rubbish.
That's what I thought.
Michel Foucault is one of the most influential thinkers of the past 60 years, and one of the most controversial ones. Arguably the most significant postmodern philosopher, he is being quoted and referenced by people from very different schools of thought, who all rely on him as an authority. Then again, there are those who claim that his writings are just woo-woo, fancy rhetoric disguised as philosophy but holding no real substance, and blame him for inspiring the gobbledygook which today passes as academic papers. In this video we are going to try to demystify some of this confusion, and understand what Foucault is saying, and, no less important, go back to a moment which to me is one of the foundational moments of postmodernism, and see first of all what is postmodernism, and then how and why it was born. Now, one thing that cannot be denied is that Foucault is very hard to read and understand. So the first thing we have to ask is, why is that? Well, first of all, there's this.
But the postmodernists, I think, are a fraud. And I'll add one little tidbit. I've actually put this in print, but you may not have run into it. I was once having a conversation with John Searle, and he told me about a meeting he had with Foucault, Michel Foucault. They were pretty close. And John speaks lovely French, very old-fashioned French, lovely French. And John said, Michel, why is it that when you and I talk, I find what you say perfectly clear and interesting, but when I try to read your books, it's very hard. I just can't understand it at all. And according to Searle, Foucault answered, he says, that's because in order to be taken seriously in France, you have to put in, I don't know what he said, 25% bullshit.
You know, I actually believe this story. Foucault suffers from the same malady that many 20th century French philosophers suffer from, namely that they deem themselves to also be poets. Part of the problem is that in France, intellectuals are treated like pop stars, so they have to write pretty. The reader might not understand a word of what they are reading, but at least they are enjoying it. When I started writing, I also suffered from this malady, because I wanted to show off my writing skills. In time I realized that I am just clouding my arguments with unnecessary fog, and learned to separate the poetic parts from the philosophical parts. When I make a philosophical video, I will occasionally start and end it with a song, or maybe a couple of jokes, but when I make the arguments I strive for the utmost clarity. This is not the French way. But Daniel Dennett and Gad Saad are going further than just criticizing the language. As we heard, they claim that the postmodernists, including Foucault, are a fraud. Here I disagree, and this video will rebuke this notion. Foucault's philosophy, I will attempt to show, is substantive, and has a lot of merit. Even in the parts where he gets too heavy with the poetry, if I put some effort into it, I eventually manage to figure out what he is saying. As for the other postmodernists, well, we are not talking about them right now. So why is Foucault so hard to read, even if we get his meaning? Well, because the stuff that he is discussing is complicated. Contrary to what some people may believe, philosophy ain't easy. What I will try to do in this video is to simplify his thought and make it more digestible. On the way, we will also see why it is so complicated. What we are going to do is focus on one book, the first significant book that Foucault wrote, namely Madness and Civilization, published in 1961. This book lays the groundwork for everything that he wrote later, and it is also, as mentioned, one of the starting points in postmodern thought, at least in my eyes. We are going to analyze the entire book and ask what merit it has for us. At that time, the early 1960s, there was a lot of criticism and protest around the treatment of insane people. There was a movement that claimed that it was cruel to lock them up in insane asylums and demanded to set them free. Foucault, in the preface of the book, says that what he intends to do is to take a step back. He is not going to wade into this debate, but rather ask how it even came about. There was a time in which crazy people lived freely, and their mad ramblings were regarded as just another form of thinking. Then, at some point, a distinction has been made between reason and madness, a distinction that became a total dichotomy in which they could no longer converse with each other, and the representatives of reason then decided that mad people have no place in society. The insane were locked up, and from then on were seen as objects of scientific research, not as people who can be part of any discussion. What Foucault intends to do in this book is to go back and see how this distinction was formed, and what it can teach us about the age of reason, and, deeper still, about what we call reason. Foucault begins the discussion by talking about leprosy. During the Middle Ages, leprosy was a serious problem, and there were tens of thousands of leprosariums all over Europe. The lepers were banished from society, quarantined in houses or living in a colony in some remote place. But they were not excommunicated from the church. They were promised that since they were punished in this world, they are going to be rewarded and saved in the afterlife. Thus, they served a purpose for the rest of the community, as they were symbols of the wrath of God, but also of His mercy. In other words, they were physically removed from the community, but spiritually they were still given a place in it. At the end of the Middle Ages, leprosy began to recede. By the 17th century, there wasn't a single leper left in Europe. The places where they were banished to, where they used to reside, remained desolate for centuries. The people of the time didn't know why leprosy went away. They just knew that what they did worked. And this model, of physically banishing a group of people from society, but still integrating them in the spiritual order of that society, will from then on be applied to other groups. Foucault then switches to talking about the representation of madness in the art of the time. In the first half of the 15th century, in a world that was coming out of the Black Death, there was an increased occupation with death in Western art. The inevitable death of man resides everywhere, and the feeling is that the end of days is nigh. But then, towards the end of the century, this transforms into something else, a constant ridicule of madness. Since the inevitability of death turns life into vanity, madness and folly are seen as the essential nature of life. So by ridiculing folly, we are making fun of life, and death is no longer so unbearable. So now, at the end of the 15th century, wisdom regards madness as representing the nature of human existence. This is manifested in art, but this manifestation takes two different forms, one in the plastic arts and the other in the written arts. In plastic arts, the imagery created by Gothic art, including all of its monstrous creatures, was still in use, but these images no longer symbolize what they did in the 12th century and throughout the Gothic era. In medieval thinking, animals were seen as different in their nature from man, and at most they could serve as symbols of human traits and values. When Gothic art presented hybrids of man and beast, it was to symbolize what the moral corruption of man might lead to. At the end of the 15th century, on the other hand, the animal symbolizes the hidden nature of man under the veneer of humanity, and because of that, the Gothic hybrids are interpreted differently. Now, they are seen as what we really are, the thing that we will revert to in the end of days, if we are not saved by Christ. They are figments of man's imagination, but the artists imagining them are having a vision of something real, the fate that awaits the sinners. Thus, they become figures that should be studied, since they teach us something about ourselves. As an example, Foucault talks about the temptation of Saint Anthony, a 1501 painting by Hieronymus Bosch. Previously, when art depicted saints being put to the test, they were usually depicted as resisting temptations of the flesh. Here, Saint Anthony has to deal with something else, figments of his own imagination, which surround him in his solitude. One of them, sitting right in front of him, is a humanoid creature with a pig's face. This is a grillos, which in Gothic art served as satire of certain types of humans. But here the grillos has an owl on its head, a symbol of wisdom, but also of heresy. He tempts Saint Anthony to explore the dark nature of man, to explore the forbidden. What is this forbidden knowledge that is hidden behind the grillos' tempting smirk? It is the knowledge of the end of days. In the 14th century, the end of days was usually depicted as the glorious triumph of God. Now, it is depicted in apocalyptic terms, in which everything descends into chaos. It is this chaos, which already resides in our imagination and dreams, which the artists manage to externalize with the Gothic monsters. They give us some idea of what it will be like. But while the artist sees only glimpses of this truth, and the wise man can only have a partial idea of it, the madman is already living that reality in full. The insane, believe the people of the time, are living in that world of the imagination. They already experience the end of days. Thus, the insane are celebrated in the plastic art of the time. One common theme is the ship of fools. Foucault points out that water, and the act of sailing over the water, were always connected to madness in Western art, because sailing is an act of being adrift, of being between worlds, just like the madman. Now this world of the madman is also seen as a world of knowledge, which we can learn from. The ship of fools thus becomes an icon of the time, and it actually existed not just in art, but in reality as well. Some madmen, instead of being kept within the walls of the city, were sent on ships to live in their own world. At the same time, literature and theatre gave madness a different place. The focus was more on folly, and madness was just the most extreme version of folly. In medieval times, folly was counted among the bad traits. Now, at the end of the 15th century, it was seen as the root of all other bad traits. But not just the bad traits. It was the driving force of many things that were seen as good as well. Since the end of days is nigh, all the things that men busy themselves with are folly, something to be mocked. While the painters depicted madness as the deepest knowledge, the writers depicted the pursuit of knowledge as folly and madness. For them, there wasn't just one madness, but many forms of madness, since madness is part of everything humans do. Their answer was comedy. By making fun of the folly of humans, we can at least pass our fleeting time in laughter, enjoying the carnival of existence in which we are led by fools. These depictions of madness would be part of 16th century literature and theatre, and would continue into the beginning of the 17th century. Crazy people abound. They go crazy for all sorts of reasons, and they stay crazy to the end. This is how it still is in the plays of Shakespeare, for instance. But during the 16th century, the apocalyptic atmosphere that dominated the previous century gradually dissipates, and in early 17th century, madness begins to be treated differently. It is now depicted as a form of delusion, as the most extreme case of errors and misunderstandings. And because of that, it can be defeated. Once the entanglement is resolved, and the delusion revealed, the madmen return to their senses. Reason and truth can overcome anything, even madness. We are on the cusp of the age of reason. Before we step over into the age of reason, though, let's do a short recap. In the period between the late 15th century and the early 17th, madness was given a place of honor in Western culture. Madness was regarded as containing knowledge about the true nature of the world and about how to live life. Thus, the voice of insanity was included in the conversation, and mad people were treated as people who had something of merit to say. If they weren't dangerous, they could roam freely. All of this was about to change. Foucault now takes us into what he calls the Classical Age. This age begins in the middle of the 17th century and ends towards the end of the 18th. He focuses on France, but similar processes happen in all advanced European countries. The beginning of this age sees the sudden imprisonment of a large number of people, around 1% of the population. In 1656, an institution called the General Hospital is established in Paris. This institution, although called a hospital, is not about healthcare. It is about confining all the unemployed people. By 1676, the law decreed that such an institute should exist in every city of the kingdom. The question is, what happened to bring about this new development? Well, unemployment has been a problem which European societies were dealing with for a while now. The economies were going through periods of boom and bust, and whenever they were busted, panhandlers would fill the streets and become a public nuisance. A person who did not work for their living was regarded as a sinner by the church, and the bums would periodically be banished from the cities, but no overall solution was found. Now, in the beginning of the Age of Reason, the state took over from the church as the moral authority, and claimed that it could use reason to devise a solution. Instead of banishment, the unemployed were taken off the streets and confined, away from view. At times when the economy was booming, they would do menial jobs for very low pay, thus providing a cheap working force. When the economy was bust, the confinement kept them off the streets and prevented civil unrest. If an individual showed capability and willingness to become a productive citizen, they were freed, but otherwise they were kept in the houses of confinement. The belief was that in this way, the state could regulate the economy and gradually eradicate poverty. This model existed for the next century and a half, but it did not live up to the expectations. Poverty was not eradicated, and the confinement actually created economic problems. And yet, the European countries remained faithful to this policy. How come? Foucault answers, because it wasn't based on reason, but on faith. Idleness was regarded as the root of all evil, as it is a rebellion against the decree imposed on man when he was banished from the Garden of Eden, the decree that he should work all of his days. If we eradicate the sin of idleness, believed the Classical Age, we will eradicate the root of all other sins, and this will lead to a more virtuous society. The end of poverty was to come as the reward for this righteousness, not as the outcome of economic processes. Allow me to break away from Foucault's discussion for a moment, to discuss something that this book shows us. We are still living in the so-called Age of Reason, and we believe that our society is based on reason. But actually, quite a bit of it is based on unreason, and one of the manifestations of it is the fact that in every period, the thought of the time regards something as the root of all evil, as the vice that all other vices stem from. There is never a good reason for this belief. It is just regarded as self-evident, because this is the conclusion that the overall paradigm of the time leads to. Later, when the paradigm shifts, future generations look in dismay at that period, and wonder how its contemporaries could not see the irrationality of their beliefs and actions. But they, too, are guilty of the same folly. Let's look at our time. In previous decades, I think one such folly was the battle against weed smoking. The belief was that weed is a gateway drug to harder drugs, and harder drugs are the reason for crime, the reason why, despite all of our reforms, crime still exists. So if we can just get people to stop smoking weed, it will result in eradicating, or at least drastically reducing, crime. Based on this belief, weed smokers were given penalties that already today, looking back, seem completely insane. And when future generations will look back at our time, I think what they will see as our folly is the way that we regard mean tweets. Crime rates are rising on the streets of London, but the police seem more occupied with hounding people who say unpleasant things online. The reason, I believe, is that they think that hate is the root of all evil, the reason for all the crimes, so if we manage to rid the internet of hate, it will prevent the crimes from happening in the first place. In the rationality of our time, it makes sense. Back to madness and civilization. Foucault points out that the unemployed, in the Classical Age, took the place that once was reserved for the lepers. First geographically, as the houses of confinement were often built in the places where lepers once resided. but also spiritually. Like the lepers in their time, the unemployed were physically separated from society, but in spirit they were made part of the new moral order. By working, even though their work wasn't worth much economically, they were helping to defeat idleness, and thus taking part in creating a more virtuous society. This, says Foucault, is the historical moment in which the state took upon itself the role that previously belonged to religion, the role of an authority that imposes morality on the public. Once this concept was established, other sorts of people started to be confined as well. The list it provides includes the debauched, spendthrift fathers, prodigal sons, blasphemers, men who seek to undo themselves, and libertines, and among them, constituting around 10% of the imprisoned, are the insane. For the first time, madness began to be seen as a social and moral problem, and for the first time, reason started to impose itself on madness and try to force it to obey its rules. There are a lot of people today who believe that the Enlightenment was a rebellion against Christianity. This is a misconception. The important Enlightenment thinkers were Christians, and the revolution was in the perception of how reason relates to religion. In the Middle Ages, human reason was generally regarded as an earthly instrument that can help us in everyday life, but cannot lead us to absolute truth. Only faith connects us to truth. For the Renaissance thinkers and artists, as we saw, the belief that reason can lead to truth was part of the folly of man, something to be laughed at. This is why the insane were regarded as manifesting some kind of knowledge, either by manifesting the folly of man or by being touched by divine truth. For the Enlightenment, reason was something that God has given man, so he can figure out the divine order of the world. This is the paradigm that persisted throughout the classical age, and in this paradigm, there was no place for unreason. The people who were confined represented unreason, an affront to the divine order, and that is why they had to be kept out of sight, and the insane, as the most extreme case of unreason, were among them. In this frame of mind, crazy people no longer presented anything about humanity, as they did in the previous age. Now they were seen as animals, devoid of any humanity. While the other confined people had to work, and were trained for certain jobs, the insane were just locked up. Foucault presents horrid testimonies regarding the conditions that they were held in, stark naked in below zero temperatures, in cells infested with vermin, sometimes chained to the wall. The belief was that they do not suffer from it, as they are as resilient as animals. In the society that saw itself as operating strictly by the laws of reason, any sign of unreason was a scandal. If some individual showed signs that they might not fit within the norms, their family itself would ask for them to be confined, because the scandal might ruin the family's name. The people who were sent to the houses of confinement were hidden away, out of sight and out of mind, and were never spoken of. With one exception. Crazy people were actually taken out of the houses of confinement every Sunday, and put on display. Crowds would gather to watch them, as you would watch animals in the zoo. Foucault asks, how can we explain this phenomenon, that seems so contrary to the logic of the time? To answer that, we once again have to rely on the model of the leper. As we recall, the leper is physically removed, but spiritually remains part of the order of the community. We mentioned that this model applies to the unemployed who were confined, but this was in relation to the order of the state. The madmen, on the other hand, were presented as part of the divine order. First, they displayed the wrath of God, as their madness was seen as the ultimate outcome of their unreasonable behavior. But, like the lepers, they also represented God's mercy. God loves all his children, even the most wretched ones, as even the insane, who are little more than animals, have a place in heaven. By being publicly displayed, the insane represent God's wrath and mercy to the rest of us, and so they play their part in creating a better society. We are beginning to see why Foucault is so hard to understand. Beyond his writing style, there is also the fact that whenever he writes about a period, he tries to take us into that period's frame of mind. We constantly have to try to free ourselves from the way that we think, and try to think in the way that 15th century people thought, or 17th century people. Every period has a structure of thought that dominates it, and it shapes the way humans perceive the world, the conclusions that they draw, and the actions that they take. In later books, Foucault would use the word epistem to indicate this structure. I usually use the word paradigm. Putting yourself in the mind frame of people from another period is an almost impossible task, but Foucault is trying to do so, and tries to help us do the same. Trying to follow his reasoning is therefore a very strenuous task, as you always have to remember the paradigm that you are in. And Foucault is not making it any easier when he starts to wax lyrical. A lot of people give up and claim that he makes no sense, but in my opinion, at least, the effort does pay off. We said that madness is the ultimate outcome of unreasonable behavior, but remember that we are now in the age of reason, in which it is not enough to just say that it is God's punishment. You have to also show it in scientific terms, of cause and effect. Before we see how the thought of the time explained the causes of insanity, let's remind ourselves that when we say unreasonable behavior, it should not be understood in the way that we understand the term today. Today, we accept that being unreasonable is part of our human nature. In the classical age, human nature is perceived as reasonable, and to be unreasonable is to act against your nature. Let's see what this leads to. 17th century medicine was still dominated by the ancient idea that the body is steered by humors. There are 4 humors, and they need to be kept in equilibrium for the person to function properly. There was also a medicine of spirits, which similarly thought that an equilibrium of spirits is the thing that must be maintained in the body. In the beginning of the classical age, the belief was that passion, which is born in the soul, upsets the equilibrium of the body, and this leads to the disintegration of the mind and to madness. So it is passion, if we allow it to rule us and don't keep it under control, which eventually leads to madness. 18th century medicine was dominated by a different idea. The essential thing was the nervous system, and the belief was that the nerves have to keep their elasticity. If they are too tight or too loose, the functionality of the organism is impaired. But here, it is not about the soul affecting the body. The soul and the body are seen as one unity. If the nerves are too tight, then so is the soul. Passions are born from this unity, and are mutual to the body and to the soul. Madness is seen as something that enters that unity through the passions, and then takes over the nervous system, until the nerves lose their elasticity and the person loses sanity. Madness, in the 18th century, is perceived as a state that has its own coherent logic. This theory is based on our experience with dreams, in which everything makes sense at the time that we dream them. The crazy person is someone who gets forever stuck in this dream state, and cannot wake up from it. So actually, under the surface, we all have madness within us. It is another form of rationality, but rationality that is disconnected from reality. This state threatens to take over our mind, if we allow it to enter it in our waking hours. And it enters through passion, through sudden shock to the nervous system. Passion leads you to unreason, to thoughts that are not rational. Once your mind gets on that track, other delirious ideas join the first ones. If you don't snap out of it, these ideas will eventually join together to form a coherent rationality, which overwhelms the real world that you perceive with your senses. Finally, you lose contact with reality, and get stuck in this alternative world, the world of dreams, the world of insanity. Once you are in this state, your mind is ruled by delusions. Your thought is still coherent, and would make perfect sense if the delusions were real, and that is why it is almost impossible to break out of this state once you got into it. Sanity is ruled by rationality, so it is rationality that has to defeat the insanity. But since the state of madness is also ruled by rationality, just rationality that is based on delusions and false perceptions, the faculty that is supposed to get you out of it is the very faculty that keeps you in. So, to avoid becoming insane, you need to prevent this other world from taking over your mind. You must not give in to passion. The 1667 play Andromache, by Jean Racine, serves Foucault as an artistic example. The hero of this tragedy is Oreste, who is passionately in love with Hermione. She manipulates him to commit murder, and then betrays him. On the morning after the night of the murder, when he realizes the situation, Oreste goes on a monologue in which he says that the world is going dark around him. This is the second stage, the stage in which passion has led you to lose connection with reality. He then sees rivers of blood and other hellish visions. This is the third and final stage, in which he is trapped in a dream world. Then, Hermione reappears in his visions, as the ruler of this nightmarish world, and she will rule his madness from now on. So this madness, symbolized by Hermione, was part of him from the start. When he gave in to his passion for her, he allowed this madness to come to the surface and take over his mind. Foucault presents this as a transitional play. It still has a hero who goes crazy, like the Renaissance plays that we mentioned earlier, although the reason given for his insanity already displays the classical frame of mind. From here on, there will be no insane heroes in the tragedies of the classical age, because it saw nothing heroic about insanity. The classical age regarded everything in terms of day and night. Day represented reason and truth, and night represented unreason and error, and there was no twilight zone between them. The tragic hero is the one who represents truth, and fights against the evil of the night. He usually fails, and the next day exposes the horrible things that happened during the night. The madman, in the classical age frame of mind, is the opposite of the tragic hero. For the madman, there is no night. This is what distinguishes the sane from the insane. Sane people can tell the difference between day and night, between truth and lie, but the insane are trapped in an everlasting day, in which they believe everything that they see and cannot tell the difference. And so, while 16th century madmen were seen as people who could teach us something, and were allowed to roam freely if they weren't dangerous, in the classical age they were seen as people who had nothing to give, and were locked away in the houses of confinement. These so-called hospitals, as mentioned, were not meant to cure people, but the classical age did try techniques to cure the insane. Foucault lists many techniques, and we will just mention some. In the 17th century, one technique was to drain out blood and replace it with other blood, often taken from an animal. The belief was that the old blood contains a bad mixture of humors, so replacing it with clean blood will reintroduce the equilibrium of humors and restore sanity. Or sometimes the patients would eat soap to clean the blood. In the 18th century, when the nervous system was the focus, patients would eat iron, seen as substance that can restore the elasticity of the nerves. Baths of hot and cold water were also used, although there was a debate whether cold water causes nerves to become tighter and hot water looser, or the other way around. Foucault points out that very little empirical research was done to corroborate the efficacy of these techniques. The belief in their efficiency was ideological, derived from the paradigm. When Foucault talks about these types of medical treatments, he points out that they seem nonsensical to us, since we live in the modern age, and our paradigm perceives madness as an illness of the spirit, which has nothing to do with the body. But, of course, the us that Foucault is referring to, when talking to the readers of his time, is not the us that I am talking to right now. Since Foucault wrote his book, there has been another paradigm shift, and today we once again believe that equilibrium in the body, especially in the hormonal system, affects the soundness of the mind. We are no longer in the modern age, and today our understanding of this issue is actually closer to that of the classical age. Closer, but still very different, so beware of projecting your frame of mind on these descriptions. We mentioned some of the medical treatments that were tried on the body, but, as we recall, we learned that body and soul were seen as one unity, so along with treating the body, there were also medical treatments given to the soul. The trick was to get inside the rationality of the crazy person, become part of it, and then try to lead them out of it. Foucault provides several amusing cases, one of them being of a man who thought he was dead, and therefore would not eat. As treatment, several people wore makeup and clothes that made them look dead, entered his room, and had a feast there, explaining to him that the dead actually love to eat. He then started eating, and this restored the equilibrium to his body and cured his madness. Now, as we can see, there were changes happening during what Foucault defines as the classical age. The switch from the focus on humors to the focus on the nervous system, for instance. So why don't these changes justify defining more ages? Because the overall paradigm remains the same. Throughout the classical age, the paradigm that believes that society should be based on reason, and thus should confine anyone who represents unreason, remains intact. Changes within the paradigm happen all the time, but not in the paradigm itself. The question is, what causes a paradigm to change? Well, at some point, the changes within the paradigm suddenly open a new possibility, a possibility to think outside of the paradigm. And if someone detects that possibility, and puts forth a new theory based on it, And if then more people start to think in that different way, eventually this can lead to a paradigm shift. Let's see how the paradigm of the classical age collapsed. In the middle of the 18th century, suddenly there was a new fear. Despite a century of confining those who represented unreason, which was supposed to lead to a society based on reason, and therefore a moral society, it turned out that unreason was not eradicated from society, and humans remained as irrational and immoral as they always were. Who is to blame? Well, said the learned people, the fault is in the air. The air is corrupt, and is corrupting the public. Once again, we need to remind ourselves that we are in a different time. Air, in the classical age, was perceived differently from how we perceive it. It was part of the environment that God created for man. It was only after the classical paradigm collapsed, and was replaced by the modern paradigm, that it became possible for Lavoisier and others to imagine and then to understand air in the way that we understand it today, as a combination of gases. If this seemed silly to you, remember that these people did not know about viruses. They could see that contagious diseases could infect you even without touch, so it was perfectly reasonable for them to believe that the contagion is in the air. So the air is corrupt. Who corrupted it? Well, the people that we confined. We put all of those people together, each with their own vice, and they morally corrupted one another. The moral corruption of the soul contaminated their bodies, and this contamination was spread in the air, making it impure. And this air is the same air that we breathe, so we are corrupted as well. Suddenly, those confined people that for a century were out of sight and out of mind became a threat to the social order. All of those kinky passions and desires, all those monsters of the irrational side of man, which for a century were not spoken of in dignified society, were now whispered of as the things that are going on behind the walls of the houses of confinement. The imagination was set free, and found literary expression in the works of one man. The Marquis de Sade wrote about violent beastly sexual acts that take place in hidden spaces, in castles and dungeons. The people of his time were horrified by Sade and locked him up, but he was only writing down what other people were whispering. It is at this point in the book that Foucault makes a declaration that shocked me when I read it. Let's read it verbatim.
But the images liberated at the end of the 18th century were not identical at all points with those the 17th century had tried to eliminate. Something had happened in the darkness which detached them from that secret world where the Renaissance, after the Middle Ages, had found them. They had lodged in the hearts, in the desires, in the imaginations of men, and instead of manifesting to sight the abrupt presence of the insane, they seethed as the strange contradiction of human appetites. The complicity of desire and murder, of cruelty and the longing to suffer, of sovereignty and slavery, of insult and humiliation. The great cosmic conflict whose peripeties had been revealed by the insane in the 15th and 16th centuries shifted until it became, at the end of the classical period, a dialectic lacking the heart's mediation. Sadism is not a name finally given to a practice as old as Eros. It is a massive cultural fact which appeared precisely at the end of the 18th century, and which constitutes one of the greatest conversions of Western imagination. Unreason transformed into delirium of the heart, madness of desire, the insane dialogue of love and death in the limitless presumption of appetite. Sadism appears at the very moment that unreason, confined for over a century and reduced to silence, reappears, no longer as an image of the world, no longer as a figura, but as language and desire.
Understand what Foucault is saying here. We are familiar today with BDSM, and know that there are people who enjoy their sex combined with pain, humiliation, domination, and torture. Those people, says Foucault, were not always part of humanity. Sexual sadism was born at the end of the 18th century. Sade wasn't simply the first who dared to put on paper what has always existed in the dark. He was describing a new phenomenon. In the book, we have reached the late 18th century, on the cusp of the modern age. But as readers who are reading this passage, what we are witnessing is the birth of postmodernism. What Foucault is stating here does not belong to modern logic. This is something that, when the book was published in the 1960s, was new. It's not a new idea to say that our sexuality, or any other part of us for that matter, is constructed by culture. But what is new here is how randomly it occurs. The narrative that Foucault is delineating is that the enjoyment of torture and humiliation, what we now call sadism, was always seen as something that belongs to the demonic world. In the 17th century, at the beginning of the Age of Reason, this demonic world was banished from Western culture and Western art. But then, as whispers began about the things that were going on in the houses of confinement, the imagination of the public was titillated by these thoughts of moral corruption, in which torture and humiliation were blended with sins of the flesh. What the classical age tried to keep out of sight instead became entrenched in our collective psyche as something sexy. Thus, by accident, without anyone intending it, torture and sexuality were interlinked in the Western mind, constructing new forms of sexual pleasures, and BDSM became a thing. The first thing we should ask Foucault is, how do you know that this is indeed what happened? How do you know that sadism didn't exist before that? We shall leave this question for later, when we discuss postmodernism. We are not there yet. Right now, we are inquiring how the modern age came about. So let's go back to the story. As we saw, in the middle of the 18th century there was much talk about how people who are sent to the houses of confinement are being morally corrupted there, and how their corruption contaminates the air that we all breathe. It was suddenly seen as cruelty to take people who were merely prone to some vice of unreason, like being too wasteful with their money, and lock them up with insane people, who are basically just animals, and whose proximity might corrupt them. While the beginning of the classical age regarded madness as just the most extreme form of unreason, towards the end of it, madness and unreason started to be regarded as two different things. And the more they talked about it, the more they got hung up on the idea that madness, rather than going away, is actually increasing, that there are more crazy people than ever before. The question was, how is this possible? Medicine had the answer. As we recall, 18th century medicine believed that what controls the body is the nervous system. But, as it was being discussed, a transformation took place in the way that it regarded the cause of madness. In the 17th century, it was believed that madness is the result of a single shock to the system, a strong passion that rattles it and puts it on the road to losing contact with reality. In the 18th century, gradually, the fault was shifted to the durability of the body to withstand these shocks. If the body is too soft, any irritation to the nervous system immediately affects all of it. Eventually, after much irritation, the soul cannot take it, and it develops resistance until it no longer feels the data from the nerves. And this is how the person loses contact with reality and becomes insane. And so, towards the end of the 18th century, insanity is no longer seen as a sickness of both body and soul, but of the soul alone. But what causes one to go insane in the first place is how they took care of their body, if they allowed it to go too soft. What makes the body go soft? Well, behavior that indulges too much in pleasures. The more hedonistic you are, the more vulnerable your body becomes to irritations of the nerves, which leads to madness. Which means that the fault for the alleged proliferation of mad people is on the liberalism of 18th century society. In the past, it was said, people's lives were a lot more regulated and disciplined, and this kept their bodies strong. But 18th century society gives them a lot of free time, so they indulge in learning too much, in reading novels, in going to theaters, in sinking into idle thoughts, in sexual promiscuity, in living a nightlife instead of by the light of day, and in other indulgences that are bad for their health. This leads some of them to lose their minds. This idea started to manifest itself in other fields of thought, and because of it, Western culture started to think in terms of progress. In the classical age, the belief was that human society is, essentially, as it always has been. But in the second half of the 18th century, thinkers started to develop the idea that it is actually changing through history, that it is moving in a certain direction. This progress could be described in positive terms, but it could also be described in negative terms, like the increase in the number of insane people. A new paradigm of thought started to emerge, a paradigm based on this idea of historical progress. the modern paradigm. We discussed how, in the second half of the 18th century, madmen started to be distinguished from the other inmates in the houses of confinement. This led to them being held in separate areas. At the same time, there was another change, as the very logic behind the confinement started to be questioned. As we recall, confinement was supposed to help the economy, but after more than a century, it was deemed a failure. Poverty was not eradicated, and the new thought argued that poverty is actually not the result of laziness of humans, but is an outcome of the forces of the market, and can never be eradicated. Furthermore, it was argued that poor people are actually essential for a good economy. People who committed acts of unreason were still being confined, but they were released after a while, back into the workforce. When the French Revolution came, confinement was finally abolished. The revolution declared that humans have a right to be free, and you can't just confine people who committed no crime. Only two types of people remained in confinement. One was actual criminals, and the other was the insane. The Constituent Assembly wasn't sure what to do with insane people. What place should they have in the new order? In 1792, it was decided to move all of them to Bicêtre, a prison near Paris, until a decision is reached. The age of confinement was over. From now on, the family would take care of those people who previously were locked up. In the classical age, the state took these people off the family's hands and effectively disappeared them, so they would not tarnish the family name. The underlying idea was that it was not the fault of the family if the person is no good, because someone's personal history has no effect on the question whether he would suddenly give in to passion. In the modern age, the family was seen as responsible for bringing its members upright, for preventing them from sinking into indulgences that might lead to corruption of their character and their body. And this structure dictated the way madmen were treated as well. In 1793, a physician named Philippe Pinel was appointed to take care of the inmates in Bicêtre. He soon became fascinated with the insane ward of the prison, and believed he can cure the people locked in it. Pinel changed the approach towards madness. The insane were not to be kept in chains and treated like animals, but invited to join the social order of the sane. They were allowed to walk freely within the walls of the ward, but were made responsible for their actions. They had to learn to behave like civilized people, and the belief was that this would rid them of their insanity. It was immoral behavior that made them go insane, and it would be moral behavior that would cure them. Thus, the insane were no longer treated as animals, but as children. Due to the work of reformers like Pinel in France and Samuel Tuke in England, they were detached from criminals, and from now on they will be kept in a place of their own, the insane asylum. In the asylum, the doctors and the staff would take the place of their family, and try to do what their families failed to do: bring them upright. The crazy person had to relearn civilized behavior. The medicine of the classical age, as we recall, believed that body and soul are one unity, and tried to treat madness by taking care of both the body and the soul. In the 19th century, madness was seen as having nothing to do with the body. It was an ailment of the psyche, brought about by immoral behavior, and thus its only treatment can be treatment of the psyche. Thus, the science known as psychiatry was born. But while the classical age tried to cure the spirit by entering into a mad person's world, and trying to converse with them on their terms and lead them back to reality, 19th century psychiatry had no interest in the mad ramblings of the insane. The order of the sane people, the order allegedly based on reason, was imposed on the crazy person, and it was their responsibility to internalize it. In the classical age, madmen were imprisoned in the houses of confinement, but there they were left alone. In the modern age insane asylums, the inmates were under constant regulation. Their own mind became their prison, as they had to internalize guilt and constant fear of punishment for behaving improperly. Foucault asks us to ponder if this is really an improvement. But in the narrative that the modern age people told themselves, this was a story of progress, of the creation of a more humane society. One example for the progress was the fact that in the insane asylums, the madmen suffered less physical abuse. When there was physical abuse, such as cold showers, it was punishment for bad behavior, whereas in the houses of confinement they were constantly suffering from such measures. But actually, in the classical age these measures were not punishment, but methods of medical treatment. Cold showers, and other such measures were seen as having an effect on the nervous system, and thus as something that might cure the insanity. Because the paradigm shifted, 19th century people could no longer understand this as treatment, and it seemed like mindless cruelty to them. And so they regarded themselves as more humane and advanced. Another example was the fact that the houses of confinement locked the insane together with criminals, which was seen as a travesty in the eyes of the modern age. How can you take people whose mind is like the mind of children and put them together with vicious criminals? But, as we recall, in the classical age the paradigm actually led to the opposite view. The first separation of madmen from other inmates already happened towards the end of the classical age, and it came not to protect the madmen, but to protect the other inmates from them, because it was deemed wrong to put them together with madmen, who are little more than animals. Again, what was seen as progress in morality was simply the result of a paradigm shift. The science of psychiatry, once established in the early 19th century, described all of this as a result of scientific progress. But actually, says Foucault, none of these changes happened due to any empirical observation or findings. It all happened in the field of morality. Since the paradigm shifted, insanity started to be viewed differently, and insane people started to be viewed differently. As a result, the view of what is the most humane way to treat them shifted as well. The science just rearranged itself around that. In the insane asylums, the psychiatrist became a godlike figure. It was the doctor who had the authority to determine what is wrong with the patient and how they should be treated. But actually, there was no science behind it. Since it completely detached from the body, from the thing that we can observe, psychiatry didn't have anything to rely on. The doctors actually just accepted the ideas of Pinel and Tuke, that the treatment should be the imposing of moral behavior on the patient. But, since they wanted to feel like real scientists, this was not enough for the psychiatrists. Throughout the 19th century, psychiatry tried to establish itself as an empirical field by observing the behavior of insane people and creating theories based on it. They didn't get far. It was only at the end of the century that Sigmund Freud found a more productive approach, and he did it by re-establishing the conversation with the insane person. After a century in which madmen were treated as little children who have nothing to tell us about themselves, Freud decided to talk to them, dive into their psyche, and find out what ails them. But while 18th century doctors regarded the insane as adults whose minds are disconnected from reality, Freud, as a product of his time, regarded them as children, whose mentality did not fully develop, and can therefore be studied to understand how we develop psychologically. Soon, he mapped out what he believed to be the structure of the human psyche, and the science of psychoanalysis was born. Here's what Foucault has to say about this new science.
It is this historical sedimentation which psychoanalysis would later bring to light, according it through a new myth the meaning of a destiny that supposedly marked all of Western culture and perhaps all civilization, whereas it had been slowly deposited by it and only solidified quite recently at the turn of this century when madness was doubly alienated within the family.
Get it? Freud claimed that he found the key to understanding the development of the human psyche, namely, the Oedipal complex. The Oedipal complex, for psychoanalysis, is something that every human boy goes through, no matter what time or culture he was born in. But actually, says Foucault, all that Freud discovered was the key to understand the European man of the 19th century. And this is because of the importance that was given to the family, and to the parents as authority figures, in the beginning of the century. This is what constructed the psyche of the people of that culture, and this, compounded by the fact that insane people were put in the position of children, is what Freud found when he talked to these people. And here, at last, we must put the question to Foucault. How do you know? How can you be so sure that this is what happened? We can understand how he reached this conclusion. After analyzing the history of the past centuries, and realizing that every period had beliefs that its contemporaries thought were universal truths, but we, looking back, perceive as mere constructs derived from the paradigm that they were in, it is logical to assume that all of what we are is also merely constructs, derived from the modern paradigm. And so it is understandable why Foucault would say that the Oedipal complex, or BDSM, are not part of human nature, but just modern constructs. But he didn't prove it. Maybe some beliefs are different. maybe Freud is actually right that the Oedipal complex is universal, an innate part of human nature. If Foucault would have argued that he showed that Freud could be wrong, since there's a way to explain the Oedipal complex as a historical construct, I would have agreed. But he goes further than that. He asserts that Freud is wrong, and here is where he jumps to conclusion. Sigmund Freud was a modern thinker. The modern age believed that all the human beliefs of the past were just narratives. They were not truths, but prejudices. At best, they were half-truths. The goal was to progress out of these prejudices, and the belief was that eventually we will get to the point where we can figure out the truth about nature. Freud's idea of progress was that we develop from animism to religion, and from religion to science, and the people of these previous stages are parallel in their psychology to the stages of the psychological development of children. So now he, possessing advanced scientific thought, has a top-down view on people from previous times, and can scientifically explain their behavior. The Oedipal complex, he claimed, was the starting point of religion, morality, society, and art. Previous societies did not realize that this complex is what is behind their beliefs and actions, so they formed themselves on shaky grounds. Modern society, seeing this truth, can build itself on solid ground. Modern thought, then, purported to liberate us from the prejudices of the past in a gradual process towards truth, which will enable us to form the best possible human society. What Foucault shows us is that Freud's presumptions to have a top-down view on previous times is itself merely a prejudice. Freud's thought was a construct of the modern paradigm, and the modern paradigm was the construct of the people whose minds were constructed by the classical paradigm. And the classical paradigm was constructed by people of the Renaissance paradigm, and so forth. In other words, we are not talking about a process of liberation here, in which our thought is liberated from prejudices. It is just a construct upon a construct, and every new construct has its own prejudices. This is what postmodernism is about. Postmodern thought showed us that the whole modern pretension of liberating us from narratives and leading us to truth was itself nothing but a narrative, born from the paradigm of its time. The idea that our mind can figure out the truth about nature is itself an unproven prejudice, which modern thinkers accepted without questioning, and it became the grand narrative of the modern age. Postmodernism purported to liberate us from this grand narrative. But here we see how postmodernism itself has fallen into a grand narrative, which it accepts without questioning, namely, the belief that everything that we are is a construct of the paradigm that we are born into. Madness and Civilization is one of the texts that is responsible for the establishment of this postmodern myth, and, as we can see, Foucault never substantiated it. Foucault himself, of course, didn't realize that this is what he was doing with his careless assertions. When you read the book, it is obvious that Foucault does believe that he can make some truth statements about the world. But looking back at it today, we can see that it led to a lot of unfortunate academic mishaps. When we talk about postmodernism today, we talk about thought that goes much further than Foucault, and often devolves into idiocy. While Foucault deconstructed certain concepts in order to show us the processes that constructed them, today there are academics who are doing nothing but deconstructing, without constructing anything instead. While Foucault casted doubts on Western culture's presumptions to be morally superior, today there are academics who take it as a given that it is morally inferior. And while Foucault tried to break away from the paradigm by applying analytic thought, today there are academics who are doing so by inventing new words, which reduce their language to gibberish. This reflects back on Foucault, and people who find him hard to understand prefer to just lump him with today's postmodernists. But I think that we have shown that, once you manage to get what he is trying to say, Foucault does make sense. So now, let's ask, what merit does his philosophy have? What can we learn from this book that we have just gone through? Well, first, we learn to be careful about things that we believe to be self-evident truths, that are universal and eternal. Even if we disagree with the postmodernists that everything is a construct of the paradigm that we are in, we have to accept that a very large portion of it is. Our thought is built on contingent grounds, and leads us to beliefs and acts that, in the future, will be regarded as irrational and silly. We should be especially suspicious of whatever it is that our age defines as the root of all evil. Secondly, we learn that we are limited in our ability to break out of the paradigm. It is not a new thing to believe that our thoughts are structured by a paradigm. It is a belief that goes all the way back to Plato and his cave allegory. But Plato, and many who followed, believed that the human mind can transcend the paradigm and see the truth. What Foucault shows is that the paradigm is structured by historical forces that are beyond our control. We can eventually break out of a paradigm, but when we do, it is through ideas that were born within that paradigm, so they are still constructed by it to some extent. In other words, those ideas are not the truth, and do not take us out of the cave and into the daylight. We just find ourselves in a new cave, a new paradigm. Third, we learn to be careful in judging people of the past. What seems like cruel and inhumane actions to us were actually done for humane reasons. We just can't see it because we perceive the world differently. Fourth, and this was very important at the time the book was published, we learned that the modern pretensions of progress are groundless. We do progress technologically, but the presumptions of progress in our morality, or in our understanding of human nature, are dubious, stemming from the fact that we do not understand the people of the past. Human civilization does change and evolve, but we cannot say with certainty that it is progressing towards being better. Fifth, and this is important for us as we read the book today, we see how and why postmodernism was born, and we can see that some of its claims are unsubstantiated. Foucault ends the book by discussing the art of the modern age. He begins with The Madhouse, an early 19th century painting by Francisco de Goya, depicting an insane asylum. He then proceeds to discuss Goya's art, and points out that it contains monsters, which remind us of the monsters of the Gothic art or the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. But in Bosch's paintings, the monsters look like they come out of the earth, part of nature. The demonic realm was perceived as real. In Goya's paintings, they are not connected to anything. As we already saw with Sade, the Gothic monstrosities are now perceived as metaphors for things that exist in the human psyche. In the modern age, art that represents unreason isn't claiming to be representing a demonic realm outside of us, but our own subconscious. But one thing that modern art does not claim to represent is insanity. There were artists who claimed that they were crazy, but they were actually just a little touched, not completely insane. Insane people, in the modern age, are not perceived as able to tell us anything of value. It is something that is true throughout the Age of Reason, for both the classical age and the modern age. Madness is perceived as the other of reason, and cannot have a say. This is how it was when Foucault wrote his book, and this is how it still is today. When the book was published, it was immediately co-opted into the debate around the insane asylums. On one side of that debate stood those who believed in the myths that psychiatry has been telling since the beginning of the modern age, and saw the asylums as the most humane solution. On the other side were surrealists, existentialists, and Marxists, who regarded them as instruments of oppressing the unique minds of people who were different. Foucault tried to show that both sides are driven by prejudices that were constructed by the modern paradigm, but his book was not understood at the time. His name became associated with the side that wanted to free the madmen. This was the fate of most of his writings since then. They were used by movements that twisted his intent, and Foucault got blamed for a lot of things that he didn't actually advocate for. I hope this video helped to shed some light on what he actually was about. To end the video, let's go back to what we started with, Foucault's style of writing. I want to read a section out of the book, and show you that his writing actually does make sense once you can decipher the poetry. We are going to read and interpret the last two paragraphs of the preface.
What, then, is this confrontation between the language of reason? Where can an interrogation lead us which does not follow reason in its horizontal course, but seeks to retrace in time that constant verticality which confronts European culture with what it is not, establishes its range by its own derangement?
Foucault wants to go beneath the language of reason. That is, he wants to see what constituted what we believe to be the language of reason, and he believes that it was born from the confrontation between sanity and insanity. For that, he doesn't want to follow the development of the language of reason, how it progressed from one idea to the next. Instead, he wants to look at the paradigms which this progress took place in. This is what he means by the distinction he makes between horizontal and vertical. The horizontal plane is where the progress takes place. The vertical plane is the paradigm that engulfs it, and if the paradigm changes, it will affect the direction of the horizontal progress as well, although the people of the time might not notice it. Every paradigm defines what is reason and what is not, and thus establishes the borders in which it believes a sane conversation can take place. This is what is meant by the pun establishes its range by its own derangement.
What realm do we enter which is neither the history of knowledge nor history itself, which is controlled by neither the teleology of truth nor the rational sequence of causes, since causes have value and meaning only beyond the division? A realm, no doubt, where what is in question is the limits rather than the identity of a culture.
Foucault is telling us that he is going to do something new here. He is not going to talk about the history of thought, as his predecessors have done. He is going to examine the history of the paradigms, those structures that establish, for every period and every culture, the borders in which it can think.
The classical period, from Willis to Pinel, from the frenzies of Racine's Oreste to Sade's Juliette and the Quinta del Sordo of Goya, covers precisely that epoch in which the exchange between madness and reason modifies its language, and in a radical manner.
This is a passage that we can understand only after we read the book, and only if we remember the sections that he is referring to. This is one of the problems with Foucault. He constantly drops names and uses references that no one can get, unless they read his books many times. Thomas Willis was one of the doctors who, at the beginning of the classical age, established the medical thinking that dominated it. Philippe Pinel, as we discussed, was the reformer who, at the end of the classical age, established the way the modern age would regard and treat insanity. Oreste is a tragic hero of Racine's play Andromache, and we discussed how he represents the transition to the classical age in art. Sade and Goya, as we mentioned, heralded the transition to the modern age. During this classical age, says Foucault, there was a radical change in the relationship between reason and madness.
In the history of madness, two events indicate this change with a singular clarity. 1657, the creation of the Hôpital Général and the great confinement of the poor. 1794, the liberation of the chained inmates of Bicêtre.
Again, two events that we discussed, which bookend the classical age.
Between these two unique and symmetrical events, something happens whose ambiguity has left the historians of medicine at a loss. Blind repression in an absolutist regime, according to some, but according to others, the gradual discovery by science and philanthropy of madness in its positive truth. As a matter of fact, beneath these reversible meanings, a structure is forming which does not resolve the ambiguity but determines it.
Here is where Foucault states his intention. He is not going to become part of the debate around the insane asylums, but rather show us how the two positions in the debate were formed in the first place. Both positions are born out of the same structure, the same paradigm. We are going to unearth this paradigm.
It is this structure which accounts for the transition from the medieval and humanist experience of madness to our own experience, which confines insanity within mental illness.
This is pretty straightforward, I think. The structure he is talking about is the classical age paradigm, and he says that by studying it, we can understand how it transitioned from the way madness was perceived in the 15th and 16th centuries to the very different way in which we perceive it nowadays.
In the Middle Ages and until the Renaissance, man's dispute with madness was a dramatic debate in which he confronted the secret powers of the world. The experience of madness was clouded by images of the fall and the will of God, of the beast and the metamorphosis, and of all the marvelous secrets of knowledge.
Oh yes, we discussed this. Before the classical age, madness used to be perceived within the Christian frame of mind, and believed to contain some knowledge about the fate of man.
In our era, the experience of madness remains silent in the composure of a knowledge which, knowing too much about madness, forgets it.
Whereas nowadays, we do not think that madness holds any useful knowledge, so we don't listen to what insane people are saying. We believe that we know everything there is to know about madness, so we completely banish it from our thoughts. Or as Foucault puts it, we know so much about it that we forget it. So, you see, once you understand what Foucault is saying, it all makes sense. You won't find any postmodern rubbish here.
But from one of these experiences to the other, the shift has been made by a world without images, without positive character, in a kind of silent transparency which reveals, as mute institution, act without commentary, immediate knowledge, a great motionless structure. This structure is one of neither drama nor knowledge. It is the point where history is immobilized in the tragic category which both establishes and impugns it.
Oh yes. That's rubbish.
That's what I thought.